Hello, and welcome to Strange Dominions, where we attempt to unlock the mysteries behind the unseen and unheard, unknown and unknowable. I am your host, Octavian Graves. Tonight, Ian and I are speaking with the magician and author, Bj Swayne. Bj is a returning guest on the show, and this time we are talking about his new book, Familiar Unto Me. This is the most comprehensive book available on the topic of the familiar spirit. We speak on his experiences with William Blake Lodge and their own familiar, what a familiar is, how to use a familiar, and how to acquire one, plus much, much more. There is a Patreon segment to this episode, and I would not want to miss it if I were you. We get into some really, really heavy stuff. If you have seen something strange or unusual, such as a cryptid, spirit, UFO, or anything in between, please send us an email at strangedominionspodcast@gmail.com. As I said in the episode before this, we are getting away from author interviews and trying to get a lot more experiencer interviews. If you have weird stories, please come on and tell us all about them. We would love to have you on. If you are enjoying this show and would like to get access to the extra show attached to it, plus the extra shows of the main shows, you can become a patron starting at just $4 a month. Patreon is full of exclusive content, ad-free content, merchandise, and the ability to interact with us directly. Without further ado, we bring you our interview with Bj Swayne. All right, Ian and I are here with author and magician Bj Swayne. And how are you doing, Bj?
I'm all right. How are you guys?
Very good. It's very good to have you back on the show.
Yeah, we're doing well, and we were both really excited to have you on. I know you've been on once before I joined as a co-host, so it's awesome to have you on and see how you've been. And you just had a new book come out, your third book, I believe. You want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, the new book is Familiar Unto Me, Witches, Sorcerers, and Their Spirit Companions. It's the most comprehensive book available on the familiar spirit. Goes through the basics of how to work with one, how to acquire one, how to care for one, and what they're capable of doing. Also talks about the history of the idea of the familiar, looking at mythology and folklore and history to create kind of a backdrop for how that idea would develop, and then looks at practices related to those historical concepts and ideas. And then it explores the work that William Blake Lodge of the Order Templi Orientis did with a familiar spirit that it contracted and had enshrined in its lodge space for over a year, and then explores some more modern takes on familiars from traditional witchcraft perspectives, and looking at how familiars would play into kind of Golden Dawn and Thelemic practices, as well as neo-pagan and eclectic Wiccan practices.
That's awesome. And I've read it, and it's very, very good. It's a lot of fun to read. It's very informative, and it just gives a lot of insight into a lot of different aspects of the familiar spirit concept. My first question is, why did you decide to write this book? What was the impetus for this specific book?
Well, I was doing a panel discussion on William Blake Lodge's familiar spirit, and as I was putting together the introduction for that panel discussion, I had already written out a course on working with familiars, and I thought that it may be interesting to do a book. And so initially it started, just as a small book about William Blake Lodge's familiar, and then kind of expanded to talking about familiars in general. And then that turned into kind of a desire to look at the familiar entirely and be sort of exhaustive about it. And so it developed from that work with William Blake Lodge and talking with people at William Blake Lodge about the work we did there, and grew into this rather large book project.
That's really cool. Would you like to just kind of start off by telling us about the William Blake Lodge familiar and the process of how you guys went about acquiring it, and then we can get into the specifics of the concept of familiars?
Yeah, of course. At William Blake Lodge back in 2019, we were having a celebration for our 25th anniversary of the local body existing, and I was asked to put together kind of like the keynote ritual for the weekend celebration. And I thought it would be interesting to do something that was a little outside of what was typical for an OTO body, or typical for most modern group work, and put together a ritual that, inspired partially by late Jake Stratton Kent, used elements of Thelema and the OTO and the Gnostic Catholic Church in conjunction with traditional grimoire practices in order to build a conjuration ritual. And then we used that conjuration ritual to conjure a demon from the Book of the Offices of Spirits and ask that demon to provide us with a familiar spirit. And then we welcomed the familiar spirit utilizing methods from Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft, and then also linking it to the current of the Lodge by using ritual elements related to the sacramental system of the Gnostic Catholic Church.
Oh, that's brilliant, the process.
Thank you.
How can you tell us how this familiar spirit, the one that dwells in William Blake, how did that come to be originally? The idea and the spirit itself. Like, how long ago is that, and what kind of provoked, it showing up and you guys deciding to do the work to summon it and bind it in the first place? Like, is there a story behind that, or just an experiment?
I think it was mostly just an experiment. I think it was something that, to me, felt like it was the type of work that would make sense for a group to be doing, but wasn't the sort of work that you typically saw from contemporary groups, and that this would be a way of expanding people's horizons and exposing them to some serious, very thorough ritual work that involved very physical material components, and kind of force them to work with something in a way where it's like, okay, this is real, this is in front of you, you've got to actually accept that, like, these things are happening and deal with them. But then it would also create something where we would have this familiar to work with us and work with the Lodge, and it would be able to benefit the Lodge and do things for the Lodge on an ongoing basis. And so that kind of justified the experiment in my mind, having something where we'd have that ongoing benefit from that relationship, in addition to kind of expanding people's horizons and showing them something new that they haven't experienced before.
And that brings me to a question I wanted to ask you is, so the way that I understand it, when it comes to the OTO, Thelema, and things like that, evocation, grimoire stuff, while it is adjacent, it's not really the center of that group's work. And so I'm curious about what the reaction was by the body, by William Blake and its participants to the ritual, and if there was any pushback or anything like that, or if anyone was pretty into it from the get-go.
Well, I would say you get a lot of people in the OTO and Thelemic systems who are very interested in Crowley's edition of Mathers's edition of the Ars Goetia. And so the idea of working with the demons in that text is pretty normal, although a lot of people approach it from a psychological perspective. Frequently they won't do the whole ritual structure for it, and just kind of look at it as a way of exploring parts of their unconscious mind. And I think that can be a reasonable method to take, but I think it's something very different than actually like conjuring the spirits and working with the spirits. It's an entirely different idea, and the results are going to be different. But you do get some people in those sorts of bodies and organizations who do explore that kind of work. And we had done a couple other similar things at Blake before, usually conjurations of angels, but we had previously done a conjuration of a spirit from the Hygromantia, using a ritual that's presented in living spirits, and that was successful and popular. When we did this conjuration for the familiar, because it was kind of a large weekend event that was celebrating the anniversary of the lodge, we did have a lot of people there, and it seemed like the people who were present for it enjoyed the ritual and thought it was good. There were a handful of people who were upper degree people, some from out of town. They seemed to enjoy it just fine. We had multiple people who had visionary experiences seeing the same symbol at the same time during the ritual. And so that seemed to be a mark of success, that multiple people had the same visionary experience, and all of them communicated it to me separately. So it wasn't something where they were able to kind of confirm or share with each other. They weren't aware of what the other ones were describing. And so I think overall it went well. Overall, the initial response to it was positive. I think as things grew with it, there were other factors at the lodge possibly that drew attention from people outside of the lodge, and some of that turned into some negative attention specifically surrounding this. There were some people who had expressed some concern about conjuring a demon in general, although that seems sort of a baseless thing to be concerned about in the OTO or Thelemic Magical Group. There were some people who were concerned because we did a ritual involving possession as a follow-up to the conjuration. And then there were some people who I think were just concerned about some wild stories that they heard that weren't actually true. But all in all, it did lead to a little bit of a kerfuffle, but I think the overall value that the spirit brought and the effects that the spirit brought are kind of a bigger thing than all the drama that ensued as a result.
It does seem strange to me that, and I imagine the people who caused a bit of that drama were probably members of the occult community on some level themselves, that there would be a negative reaction in a magical lodge to doing magic. But I suppose some of us shouldn't be surprised. But on a note on that, what validated for you? I know you said you had some objective validation on people, experiencing the same symbols or the same sigils related to their work to you independently. But were there any events or experiences or interactions or communications that you had specifically that truly validated and to you served as a, like you really understood that there was that specific familiar there and that it was communicating? Did you have any experiences with it personally as it grew? I suppose it grew stronger and, solidified its presence in the lodge itself. Like, did you have any personal experiences in the lodge after the works that really demonstrated that it was here and, powerful in doing its work?
Yeah, I think those questions of verification are always interesting, because I think a lot of times people get very attached to the idea of like, okay, well, they asked the spirit something, or they felt something, or they heard something, and so that verifies it for them. But it's still something that's really just unverified gnosis at that point. It's still their feeling or what they've heard, until it becomes something that's like operable, that they can go out and prove in the world or see a real world effect. Like I said, in the initial conjuration, we had multiple people who saw the same symbol for the spirit. And that to me was an interesting thing. We had someone went and researched the name of the spirit and found different things connected to the name that kind of connected with the lodge or other work that we've done. And that's kind of like interesting trivia, but it doesn't really prove anything. Similarly, there were times where I would come into the lodge and I would kind of feel the presence or feel some communication from the spirit. Excuse me. And again, it's always nice to have those sorts of woo moments where you are like, oh, wow, there's like a spirit here. There's a thing, which, I mean, for your paranormal listeners, that's going to be kind of the same sort of thing where they go into a place and they're kind of curious whether or not there might be ghosts or spirits there, and they see signs or they get feelings or feel like a change in temperature or like a pressure or something that feels like it's communicating with them. But when it's just your feelings, you still don't necessarily know. So some moments that were interesting as far as things that stepped beyond just feelings. We had a guest speaker, it was actually Jason Miller, who was at the lodge, and one of the caretakers for the familiar, they had some back and forth with Jason online, and were a little frustrated with some of his positions on things. And I guess the familiar may have taken some umbrage to that, because the moment Jason stood up to begin speaking at a class event that he came in for, there was an explosion over at the familiar shrine. And I was the main officer that was present for that weekend, so I got up to go check and see what had happened. And we had a large, heavy-duty ceramic ashtray, like one of those ones that is either for someone who is just like chain smoking multiple packs and they need a huge ashtray, or like you're putting one out in like a club where you're expecting to have multiple people using it. Like it was like
like one of the big dark green ones, kind of thing.
Yeah, like 5-6 inch diameter ashtray, and like a good like half-inch thick ceramic, and all of it was used for the incense, and so it had coals around it. Now, only one coal was lit that day to provide incense for the spirit, but when I went over and the ashtray had split into pieces, every old coal that was left from any previous use was now like glowing bright red. Like the entire ashtray had lit up, and everything was ignited. And it wasn't like the coals were touching each other or near each other. There was plenty of space between them throughout this ashtray, but somehow they had all gotten to the point of being like superheated, where it just broke the ashtray. And that seemed really bizarre and a little unnerving.
Yeah, I would say so. I've actually had one of those explode before in the past, so I can attest that they are it's shocking when they do. It sounds like a pretty big boom. And that's fascinating.
And then I talk a little bit in the book about when we did our possession ritual, or our witch's sabbat, to celebrate the familiar. The familiar said a couple things to me while it was possessing someone, that it referenced stuff from a few weeks earlier that had happened in another ritual, where no one in the lodge knew about my experiences from that other ritual, but the familiar talked about them and referenced them, and did this while speaking through a person that it was possessing. And then also made references to things from my childhood that no one else in the lodge knew about. And so it was a little unnerving there also, that there were these things that had to do with spirit interactions that I hadn't talked about with anyone, where the familiar was now kind of talking directly to me about them while possessing someone. There was also some stuff at that event where there was a gift that someone was going to get for the familiar, but they couldn't acquire it, and their familiar spirit told them not to worry about it, that it was taken care of. And then someone else who was just a guest ended up bringing that exact gift. It was like a specialty case, like wooden box of absinthe, and it was like a special order type of thing. And the person said that they just saw it and like had this sense that someone was telling them that they had to buy this for the familiar spirit. And so it was kind of interesting there, because it was something where a separate familiar was telling someone like, oh no, this is taken care of, you don't have to get this. And then someone else shows up with the very thing. And there were a lot of weird little coincidences like that, which they maybe don't necessarily prove things, but when you've got enough of them, it starts creating like an eerie sort of sense of, all right, something weird is happening here.
And that's always, when it starts happening to you, it's very confirming in its own way. And it's kind of like you're in a secret club, because you know what's going on and a couple other people know what's going on, and that's just for you. I think that's a really, really cool effect. And I really like, so the ritual that you have in the back of the book, is that the exact one that you used to acquire the familiar? So if someone who bought the book did that to a T, they would be able to get something similar to those results that you got? Or is there anything that needs to be altered or anything like that to get familiar as you got?
That is the exact ritual as written, and the book also provides detailed explanation of the things that I did in preparation for it, as well as discussing some of the elements of performance and kind of what we experienced afterwards. So it does provide a good guide for someone trying to do that. Now, the ritual in particular is set up for people who are working from an OTO perspective with participation in the Gnostic Catholic Church. But it also kind of lays out how you would adjust things and change things if you wanted to work it, say, from like a Golden Dawn perspective, or if you wanted to work from some other sort of group's rubric and tie into that group's current. But you could perform it just exactly as it is there. Now, the one difference, again, the ritual presented is the way that it was scripted. When we were performing the ritual, one of the bishops from the Gnostic Catholic Church that was present requested that we not use the actual verbiage that's used in the sacrament rituals when we were baptizing and confirming the Spirit. And so on the fly, we had to kind of change that. So that would be the one thing that would be a little different, but that would be a very small thing. And so that's something where you could make an amendment to kind of personalize that, or you could run with it as it is presented.
That's so cool. That is really
that
cool.
is a very cool story.
And I there's a lot of rituals in this book that I am very, very keen to try, and I think Ian is as well. And I want to get your opinion, talk about those specific rituals. But before we do, I want to just, for people who are totally new to this concept, who really have no idea what we're talking about, can you give just a very plain description of what a familiar spirit is and what it is we're talking about here?
Yeah. So I think in kind of modern parlance, a lot of people around the magic community just sort of think of their pets when they think of familiars, because the idea of having a spirit that's bound to work with you and kind of go around with you is something that wasn't really part of what you saw in your mass market magic books for the last several decades. And so people were like, well, this familiar idea, what is it? I guess it's just my pet cat. In the book, I go into a lot of why it's not your pet cat. Familiars in history were always spirits. Sometimes they would show up as animals, but those animals would walk on their hind legs. They would talk. They would suggest solutions to problems. They would do magic for you. They would change shape. So clearly, they weren't actual physical animals. They were spirits. So for a basic idea of what a familiar is, the word familiar itself just means something that's known to you, that's close to you, something that is that you're familiar with. And that's basically the idea, is it's a spirit that instead of you having to look this spirit up in a book and go through a big ritual to call on the spirit, it's a spirit that's bound to work with you. And so that can either be from you calling upon a spirit that this spirit is subservient to and making a contract with that spirit, and then it binds one of its servant spirits to be your servant at that point, or from encountering a spirit and then entering into a pact with that spirit specifically for it to work with you and teach you and help you with things. And typically the relationship is one where it provides instruction, it provides assistance magically, it might provide some protection, it might perform tasks for you, but generally helps you facilitate magic and developing as a magician in general. And it's something that is one of the most well-attested ideas in Western magic, or in European magic. We see it throughout the grimoires. We see it throughout witch trial accounts. We see it throughout folklore. It's a very common concept. I would say for your listeners who are not from the magic community, more the paranormal community, if, say, you moved into a house and there was a ghost that haunted figured out things that it liked, and you developed like a good working relationship with that spirit through providing it with music or scented candles or some sort of like gifts that it likes periodically, and then that ghost does things to help protect your home, help bring beneficence to your family, bring prosperity, and keep away other spirits that might be bad, that might be trying to hassle you. That would be similar to a familiar spirit relationship in that case.
And that's a really, really helpful tactic. And I think that one that we have been trying to impress on the paranormal community is that spirits have abilities, and they have things that they can do to help us with other things. And just trying to banish everything and make things move on, it's not always as helpful. It's not the only option. And I think having a familiar spirit, for whether it be a paranormal investigator, a cryptid investigator, or even a UFO researcher, I think having a someone on the inside of the other world, as we'll call it, is extremely helpful and extremely beneficial, and one that would really advance the work of these fields tenfold, in my opinion. And I think that I think this would be a very helpful idea for a lot of people outside of the magical community, as it is for people in the magical community. You answered like 3 of my questions already just in that one explanation. But the one thing that I really wanted to ask you about is, so in your book you have, 3 different dynamics for acquiring a familiar. One being the work you did at William Blake, one being a ritual to the witch's devil, and one being to the Queen of Elfhame. And I'm curious, which outside in those 2 paradigms, the witch's devil and Queen of Elfhame, which one have you done personally, or which one have you seen a lot of success with when it comes to acquiring a familiar?
So the Witch's Devil and the Queen of Elfhame rituals. The Witch's Devil one, that is based on a ritual that I've done for contacting the Witch's Devil for a pact, not to obtain a familiar, because I'd already obtained a familiar through that spirit in a previous ritual, which, because of some of the aesthetic elements of that ritual, wasn't able to include it in the book. But the prayers and methods used for calling on the Witch's Devil that are presented in that ritual, I've used, like with going to the crossroads at 3 a.m. on a Thursday and going through the Our Father prayer and the Bhagavi prayer and all of the different elements that are presented there. And from that, I was able to obtain some methods and approaches for magic that were new, which I actually talk about a little bit in the Witch Blood book that I'll be releasing shortly. And also had some things where there was some healing and some other things that I was asking for help with that I was able to obtain through working with that ritual. So I can say for that one, well, I haven't used that ritual for obtaining a familiar. I have used it for creating contact and obtaining things from that contact, and that one works, and you can go out and use that. The Queen of Elfhame ritual, that is based on elements from some traditional rituals for interacting with the Fairy Queen and doing a fairy meal. I've used some similar elements for contacting the Fairy Queen for some work that continues in the same vein that the book talks about successfully, but it's based on some stuff that's pretty standard throughout history. And so that one is a little bit more experimental. And those are kind of intended as examples of, like, this is how you put these rituals together. These are what the elements would be that you would draw from by looking at some of the historical elements that would typically be in those rituals. So that's something where if the way the ritual is presented exactly in the book isn't your cup of tea, or if there's things that you would want to change, those are kind of presented more as like a template, or as a, here's an example. And the book does walk through like what the logic is behind the ritual, why it's set up the way it is, why its pieces are the way they are. And so you kind of have the roadmap to go through and say like, okay, I see where this makes sense. I see why this is the way that this is, but this doesn't fit with how I work or how I want to approach this. So I have the logic to go in and alter this and experiment with it and see if that works. And then if it doesn't, then go through, try it the way that it is in the book, or go through and try a different tweak and see if something else works.
That's really awesome. And I think that I'm very excited to try it out. I'm very keen on doing that. And it's a very comprehensive way you write about these rituals, and it seems very step-by-step and easy to understand. The one thing that I thought was really cool is I think a lot of people, when they hear the term familiar, they assume that that is a type of spirit in and of itself. But can you talk a little bit about that and what that actually is and how that's not necessarily true?
So familiar is more the relationship than it is a type of spirit. And so pretty much any type of spirit could work as a familiar. Now in the book, I talk about household spirits like brownies and hobgoblins and spirits like that. And there's certain elements of their folklore where they don't like to be tied down and subservient. They like to have a contract and work and interact, but they still want to be themselves and not feel like they're owned or subservient to the humans in the household that they work for. So those spirits might not be as amenable to being familiar spirits, but there's a lot of elements of how they work that does kind of fit with that. And so depending on how you're contracting the relationship, that could work as well. More typically, you're going to see ghosts, fairies, demons. Those are the types of spirits that we tend to hear people talk about as familiars, but you could also have angels. Excuse me. The book talks about working with elementals as familiars. We also talk about looking at dead animals, particularly ones that were previously pets, but not necessarily ones that were previously pets. So you can really work with just about any sort of spirit. You just have to look at what your goals are, like what you want the relationship to look like, what you want to get out of that relationship, and that will help you with deciding which type of spirit to pursue. And the book actually talks about that in a couple places, as far as what types of spirits to look for and how to kind of make the decision as far as what method and what spirit type you want. As far as the variability of that, when I was a child, I saw ghosts frequently, and there was one ghost that kind of instructed me and guided me and helped me navigate that and avoid things with spirits that would be more frightening or difficult to deal with, as well as introduced me to nature spirits that taught me early magic that became some of the first magic that I learned and did. And while I wouldn't say that that was necessarily a formal familiar spirit relationship, because it wasn't something where there was a contract or where I was giving things to that ghost in order to get it to do these things, the ghost was kind of looking out for me because of a familial relationship. That's something that's very similar. And so it's an example of how you can have that kind of relationship with a spirit from the dead. But if you look through history, a lot of your witches' familiars are described by the witches as being from the fairies and are types of fairy beings, whereas your witch finders would generally describe them as devils. And we see, obviously, in books of demonic magic that several of the demons provide good familiars. And so we know that that's also a source for familiar spirits.
That was a really good comprehensive answer. Now, in your opinion, from your personal experience, of all the different types of spirits in that you could meet now? It's clearly been stated that any sort of spirit could potentially be a familiar, because familiar is a role, not necessarily a type. What sort would you think is the most amenable to being a familiar, to working with a magician or a practitioner, out of all the different sorts, if we could categorize them?
That is a good question. I have not worked with a familiar from the Olympic spirits previously, but the Olympic spirits tend to be the most amenable spirits to working with humans in general, and they get referred to as the familiar spirits of planets in the Key of Rabbi Solomon. And I actually present a ritual from the Key of Rabbi Solomon for obtaining a familiar spirit bound to a ring from the Olympic spirits in the text. And so I would say if you're looking for something that's going to be very amenable and like friendly and about that relationship, probably a familiar drawn from the Olympic spirits or from the elementals. The elementals also have a desire to work and interact with humans, and I do also present methods for working with the elementals to obtain a familiar. And in my experience, both working with elementals and working with Olympic spirits, they both are super keen to work with humans and help humans. So they probably are the most amenable. Now, I've seen where demons are very readily willing to provide familiar spirits. Now, the thing there is you've got the demon who's like, yeah, sure, I'll give you a familiar, but they're not the one that's actually going to be bound as the spirit. So just because the demon that's in charge is like, yeah, you can have this familiar spirit, doesn't necessarily mean the spirit is going to be all about it. I haven't run into an experience where a demon was like bucking or resisting at being a familiar spirit. They seem to just kind of take it as this is part of what they do. So I don't think there'd be any issue there. I have not worked with fairy familiars. They seem to be a very common source for familiar spirits, but I could also see where they could be a little bit trickier and maybe not as keen in all cases, but it might also just depend on what the fairy is getting out of the relationship as far as how amenable it might feel to it. The dead are an interesting one because obviously a lot of my work involves the dead. But when you're working with like your ancestors and stuff, those are spirits that are going to be fairly amenable to working with you and kind of have your back and want to do things for you, but those are not spirits that you would use as a familiar spirit because familiar spirits typically are bound to you. And so traditionally when you are dealing with the dead as a familiar, you're working with one of the unquiet dead. So someone who died and has some sort of business left behind that they need to take care of, or someone who died and didn't receive proper funerary rites, or who was murdered or died young or in an accident. So someone where they're disquieted spirit. And so the people I've known who've had the dead as familiars seem to have fine relationships with them, but sometimes they're a little erratic and opinionated. They may also be a little more limited in what they can do. But I think generally that relationship is going to be one where if you're helping them with what they need help with or providing what they need, then they should be relatively amenable. It might just be a more temporary relationship than other spirits.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. That was what I was looking for as well. So thanks for that. Now, in my personal work for several years, I've been doing also work probably a little different from yours with familiars. And so I'm very interested in getting a hold of your book, especially your what you've said and done with elementals as familiars. Now, trying to think of how to formulate the question because I kind of had one for you, but how is your thoughts on having spirits dwell in consecrated objects, specifically bound familiars? Because I know that kind of carries over to other works. Rufus Opus's Spirits in the Stone, things like that. And that goes back to Babylonia, Mesopotamia, essentially the idea of spirits dwelling in their idols. And, and I kind of asked that because a big popular part of the more New Age and neo-pagan magical crowd is everybody likes crystals. In fact, for some, that is the highlight of their magical career. I don't say that negatively, but there's a lot of talk and there's a lot of books, and some of them a little more surface level than others that, deal with crystals, stones, things like that. It is, elements of power or whatever. But I've always found it interesting that now, while most people in those communities do not associate stones and crystals with actual spirit work, with literal spirits, I found that the connection between not just stones, but objects and idols and crystals and in general as being either sources of certain small elemental spirits or fairly good dwelling places for spirits to rest in or make home in as unique. What are your opinions on that? Do you think it would be, do you find spirits, and we use the word amenable again, to find themselves dwelling in stones is good for them? Is that a good way to, or let me rephrase, are certain spirits of certain types who become familiar, is it good to invite them to dwell in a spirit house, a jar, a phylactery, or even a stone or a crystal, or some cases I've worked with a pendulum? Hey, do you have any experience with that or any comment?
Yeah, I think it's at the very least hospitable to provide them with some place or some anchor. I think it also helps us as humans to have some sort of physical touch point that we think about. But another way to look at it, and so like the familiar that we had at William Blake Lodge had a jar, and the jar was prepared with a combination of dirts, and those dirts had herbs and incenses and blood mixed into it. And then there was a skull that was placed in the jar that had the spirit's seal painted in blood on it. And the pact was fed to the skull.
I think we lost you.
Spiked down around the skull to help bind it in place before sealing the skull in the jar.
BJ, before you go on with that, we lost. You cut out for a second.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you. There was just a long lapse, and right when you mentioned feeding, you mentioned the skull in the first part. That's when you cut out. So if you want to start back from there, I apologize. Are we doing? And don't worry, we can edit this out. It's not live. So, but yep, I think we've lost you again. Say something.
Okay. All right. So I'll go back and start that.
All right. Now you're kind of coming in.
We put together a jar as. Okay. Is it good now?
Be the possibility. Yeah, it's sounding a little better now. Perhaps the familiar itself is taking a peek into this conversation.
Yeah. All right, I'll try describing the jar again. All right. So when we set up our familiar spirit at William Blake Lodge, we put together a jar as a spirit house. The jar had in it dirt that was a couple different dirts, some specially selected, and they were combined with herbs and incenses and blood. And then we also had a skull that the spirit's seal was painted onto with blood paint. And the pact that we signed in receiving the familiar, excuse me, was fed to the skull. And then around the skull, there were a series of names of spirits staked down as part of the binding process. And then the jar itself was sealed. Now, it might sound like that's intended as like a prison or something locking the spirit in, but I think it serves more as an anchor and a place that the spirit has a foothold in the physical world. So spirits, when they're coming through trying to interact with the physical world, that can take a lot of energy. It can take a lot of effort and force for them to break through the barriers between their world and our world. And so having elements that are linking them to our world, either through their interactions with us, through ritual components, through the things that we're feeding them, those things make it easier for them to come through and interact. And having a physical home that's permanently set up for them is a very strong anchor, a very strong connection that allows them to work in the world around us. So I think in general, having those sorts of spirit houses is a very good thing. And I think there's lots of different approaches and lots of different materials that you can use for that. Obviously in the book, as I mentioned, there's a ritual for connecting spirit to a ring. I talk a bit in a few places in the book about spirit houses and what goes into assembling one. Don't really talk about the living statue concept of of kind of drawing a spirit down astrologically to inhabit a statue, as we see back in antiquity. It's a very related concept, and a concept that connects in, but can also be kind of its own separate thing as well.
I was going to say that would be several chapters most likely, and it would be, you'd have to do a lot of discussion that gets into religion, essentially, I think.
Yes.
And just a lot more than it would kind of deviate. So I understand why you would hold off on that, but thank you for mentioning the connection between them, because in my opinion, there's certainly similarities, and they are very important similarities, but perhaps not necessary to working with getting a relationship with a familiar and working that, for its own sake, is I think the point of your book is. Now, I wanted to ask a slight deviation, but you have been, we're acquainted in real life, and I follow your work for a couple of years, and you have been a very a loud, in a good way, voice in kind of the sphere of people that have been really pushing for the occult community and the greater community as a whole to recognize that spirits are unique and individual, objectively real beings in their own sense. And of course, you have a book called Living Spirits, which certainly, it gets that point home. And as you mentioned earlier, in the last several decades, there's, in a lot of ways, been a tendency for people to fall into the paradigm of the psychological model that, spirits are essentially in many ways just, constructs of the subconscious. And, I personally think that having people who are educated and experienced push back and give the other side of that, and as I would consider the reality that, spirits are, reality is a very big place. There are many, perhaps infinite different kinds of spirits, and they are as real in a conscious, intelligent sense as we are, and as the planet, parts of the planet that we can see and that we can interact with, even though it is sometimes challenging and a unique between different people on how those spirits manifest or communicate. But I think it's important that people hear, at least even if they don't agree with it or their path takes them in a more psychological angle, to be educated and hear that side of it, and to have that voice in the occult community, that it almost serves the spirits in a sense, and to get that education, to get that, you have, and others in the Living Spirits model, as I want to call it just for this conversation, I think you're doing good work. And I think people who take the time to read your material, hear your opinions, and do that work from that angle themselves, most importantly, I think they are going to have an entirely greater dimension to their magic and their work than otherwise. And you mentioned it before. So I just wanted to tell you, I think that's important, and it's important work that you've been doing and putting that voice out there. And I could even say that perhaps in at least more serious occult circles that has taken its place as more of the norm. Do you have any comments on that?
I think it's something where it's interesting to see how much that has changed and how much that perspective has grown in the last several years. Definitely when I was starting out. When I was younger, it was definitely something where most people looked at things as being about energy and psychology and archetypes. And it's been interesting seeing the change as more people approach a realism around spirits in the spirit world. And I think that sometimes there's a bit of a backlash where people want to reject the idea that anything related to energy or anything related to the psyche connects with magic. But I think we can't ignore that those are components of reality any more than we can ignore that spirits and other sorts of beings and intelligences and existences outside of our own also exist as real things.
Of course.
I think that what is really a benefit of people being more open to that is the more we're able to look at the reality of the world and look at the world beyond just a materialist structure and look at the actual components of it and engage those components for what they are, the more we're able to explore what's possible and what can be done and what we can have access to. There's more sources of knowledge that we can draw from, more potential types of power that we can obtain and utilize in that case. And I think that that's something that people really need to recognize, is that magic isn't about a fantasy or about what we want things to be. It's about the world that we're actually engaging in front of us. And that when we engage the actual reality of that world, then we hold on to something that is tangible and powerful and effective and can actually create things in the world. If we're only thinking about what our wishes are and what we'd like things to be and what's comfortable to us, then we can have a healthy fantasy life or a healthy series of thought experiments. But as far as actually making real changes in the world beyond just changing ourselves and our perspectives, we lose some of that capability. So a return to trying to explore the world and engage the world more deeply, I think, is going to be a big game changer for the development of magic going forward.
That's a really, really beautiful way of putting that, and I really like that answer. We're winding down to the main show here, but before we go, and I definitely want you to let everyone know where they can find you and your information, I have 2 Patreon questions for you. The first one is from Lindsay, and she asks, what are some safe ways, if any, to end or pause a relationship with a familiar spirit in the case that you may no longer be able to honor your commitment to them? Like if you decide to work on a different path, or if you'll be in the hospital long term and are unable to feed them, do promise rituals, etc.
Well, I think some of it depends on the type of the spirit and the relationship already. Sometimes just kind of letting things grow apart and dwindle accomplishes that. If you're not keeping up your end of the bargain, sometimes the spirit will just move on. There are some spirits that might be a little bit more aggressive about that, though. And so in that case, you may need to actually address the spirit, explain that you want to wind things down, that you want to end the relationship, maybe determine if there's any sort of payment or offering that should be made as part of ending the relationship. You might negotiate with the spirit whether or not it wants you to pass its associated material along to another magician who might be able to establish a relationship with it. A lot of it will be fairly individual. It's sort of like ending a relationship with a person. You're going to have to kind of feel it out and work with them. Now, if it's something where things are broken down to a point where there's a problem, then you might literally destroying some of the objects or elements that are associated with the familiar in order to remove that connection or break apart that connection. But hopefully most people aren't in situations where they need something like that.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. The second question we have is from Paula, and she says, "Hi there. What or who has been the most influential spirit companion that you have worked with?"
Ooh, that. Oh my God, that's a tough one because I mean, at this point, I've been studying and practicing magic since I was 11, so that's like 30 years, and was working with spirits before that. So, I guess foundationally, the ghost that I mentioned earlier is the ghost of my grandfather. That was the spirit that helped kind of connect me to the spirit world and interacting with spirits, and introduced me to nature spirits that taught me magical things. And some of those nature spirits were ongoing spirit relationships that I still have connections to, that I've worked with since I was about 6 or 7. And so those have been ongoing things, not necessarily, again, spirits that I would call familiars, but they were spirits that definitely had that type of relationship of being in close proximity and easy to interact with. I guess there's also been like certain gods that I've set up devotional relationships with that were particularly shaping and transformative, and those have varied over time at different phases in life. But again, those are separate from familiars. So, I mean, I think there's been lots of different spirits that have had an effect, and it all just kind of depends on the different phase of life.
Perfect. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So before we go to the Patreon show, do you mind telling everyone where they can find you, your books, your information, and all your works?
Excuse me. The easiest place to find me is on Facebook, because I'm pretty bad at social media, so I just do the geriatric millennial thing and use Facebook. I am on Twitter, but barely. So you can find the page for my blog, Glory of the Stars, on Facebook. There's also a Bj Swayne author page, as well as just my regular Facebook page, Bj Swayne. And so announcements for things go out through those spaces. The book is available on Amazon and will be available through barnesandnoble.com shortly. Currently, it's available in Kindle and paperback. The hardcover editions should be available soon as well.
And you also run the Living Spirits Facebook page, correct?
Yes, the Living Spirits group on Facebook, which my book is named after the Living Spirits group. The group is not named after my book. I am not so egocentric as to do that. So
no, I got to attest.
But yes,
I'm in that group, and that's
wonderful group,
informative one.
Thank you. I'm glad people like it.
Awesome. Well, I will put all those links in the description below. And for our regular show listeners, we will see you again in another episode. But for our patrons, you will get to hear the rest of this conversation in the patron section. So thank you so much, BJ. We really liked having you on, and we cannot wait to have you on again for your future works. And that was our interview with Bj Swayne. We really love talking to BJ, and we cannot wait to have him on again. We cannot wait to start doing some of these rituals and acquiring our own familiar. Maybe we'll even have a familiar for the show. If you would like to get a familiar, please check out this book. It is well worth your time. Thank you again for listening, and if you would like to get access to the extra show that is attached to this, which I highly recommend you do, please go sign up at our Patreon. It's just $4 a month, and you get loads of extras. Otherwise, we will see you again on the Strange Dominions.